We're going to call the special meeting for Akron City Council to order. At this time, our clerk will read the roll.
Baylor. Aye. Connor. Aye. Freeman.
Aye.
Fusco.
Aye.
Holland.
Aye.
Kamer.
Aye.
Lombardo.
Aye.
McKittrick.
Aye.
Malik.
Aye.
Mosley.
Aye.
Neal.
Aye.
Amobian.
Aye.
Somerville. Aye. All members are present.
Thank you so much. So the purpose of our special meeting today is to discuss the redistricting for the city of Akron. So at this time, I'm going to pass it on to Councilman Fusco.
Yeah, thank you. Everyone here, I hope, has seen the map. This is what was discussed with the consultants. I believe this is Triad's third time in terms of looking at the maps and redistricting, which is we are required, mandated per charter, that every 10 years following the census, the city look at those boundaries and we make sure that they're as even as possible. So we asked Triad to do that, just that. I believe 10 years ago we got it right in terms of forming neighborhoods a little better than in the past. And so neighborhoods got under one ward. There was a couple of them. Highland Square comes to mind. Goodyear Heights comes to mind. There's some neighborhoods out there that were split, and representatives could live outside of that larger neighborhood. So that was 10 years ago. I'll let the consultants go ahead and present here, but I think there's some good news. I sincerely know there is good news with this, with the discovery of what the census had bore out for us just last year, or in 2020. It's very interesting, and there is good news there, but then again, it requires a lot of work on their part. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Dykes.
Is my mic live? Okay. My name is Bob Dykes, and my company is Triad Research, and I'm here tonight with my partner in this effort, Dr. Mark Salling, a longtime professor at CSU. Just to give you just a little background, Councilman Fusco did that. It was my pleasure to work several times with the council in the past in redrawing these ward boundaries. And Dr. Salling and I have had extensive experience in working with a number of communities in redrawing the wards, both in this cycle and in other cycles. This time around, you may have read, we were on the team that drew the Summit County Council districts a little while ago. And in terms of communities in Summit County, we worked with Cuyahoga Falls, most notably, in redrawing their ward boundaries. So I think that's kind of enough of a background to say that we're glad to be back here again. One of the starting point we have for all of this is the 2020 census data from the Census Bureau. And there are really three things that stood out for us when we looked at the 2020 census for Akron. And the first thing really is in a sense interesting to me was that the population of the city did not change very much. 10 years ago, the population was 199,000. This year, it's 190,000. That's a change of a little over 4%, a decrease of a little over 4%. So one of the things that we would expect is, given that we drew the populations of the current wards that you all represent to be pretty close to each other, we wouldn't expect there to be a big divergence in terms of the ward populations that we see now. And I think Dr. Selling has a slide that will show you the current wards and the populations of those current wards. And indeed, what we see in these wards is that, with one real exception, the populations of the wards are relatively close to each other. One of the things we look for in particular is the deviation from the average ward population. The courts, following the Supreme Court ruling on one person, one vote, the courts have generally allowed cities about a 5% variation from the average for the ward size as being acceptable or allowable. And indeed, if you look at the Ohio Constitution, you will see that the Constitution allows a variation of no more than plus or minus 5% in the legislative districts for the state. So this 5% variation is very common. And when so we have here what the maximum population can be in 1999, and what the minimum population can be. And what we see is that 8 of the 10 wards, as they are currently drawn, are within the 5% variation from the current city population. But 2 of the wards are not. Ward 3, the ward of the council president, is a little below and would need a minor upward adjustment in population. But the outlier in terms of the population of the wards is Ward 2, which is 2,700 plus above the average ward population. And to bring Ward 2 down to the maximum number that a ward can have would require a loss of almost 2,000 people in Ward 2. So Ward 2, just on a population basis, is going to be the ward that really has to change a considerable amount. The third thing we looked at was the racial composition of the city and the wards. And Dr. Salling is going to make a presentation in a couple of minutes about the Voting Rights Act. But when we look, Akron, as you know, in the current cycle, had 3 wards, Ward 3, Ward 4, and Ward 5, in which there was a majority of minorities in those wards. Well, when we look at the distribution of the wards this time, we find that there are 4 wards that have a majority minority population. And those are, again, wards 3, 4, and 5, and Ward 2. So Ward 2 is not only the ward that's going to require the most difference, most change in terms of its total population, we also have to be mindful of the fact that it is a minority-majority ward, and in our view, that's something that the city should be very mindful of maintaining as we redraw these ward boundaries. And that is, in fact, what we did. And the plan for the wards is actually quite simple. Ward 2 is bounded by wards 5 and 10 largely, and those wards can absorb a substantial amount of the population that Ward 2 has to lose, and then the other wards beyond Ward 2 and Ward 5 can change very slightly. In fact, I believe there's one ward that I believe Ward 9 did not change at all. I believe we left Ward 9 exactly as it was because the population was okay. And you can see it's in the opposite corner of the city from Ward 2. So in a sense, it's about as far away from the locus of change as you can get. So I think that if you look at this ward plan, I think one of the things we tried to do is to maintain a continuity of representation insofar as that was possible. I think that one of the things that is difficult for people is when they are moved from one ward, voters, is when they're moved from one ward to another. And I think if you can minimize the amount of change in the ward boundaries, the continuity of representation, both for individuals and businesses, is a plus. So that's the genesis of how we arrived at the proposed ward plan you're going to see. Reducing the population of Ward 2 by about 2,000, maintaining the majority-minority status in Ward 2, which we did. In fact, we actually increased very slightly, but we increased the minority-majority percentage in Ward 2 in its reduced proposed state, and then making the minor changes we needed to, bringing Ward 3 up to a level where it's within the plus or minus 5% range, and so forth. That was really the plan that we pursued in drawing these ward boundaries. Mark, did you want to make any additional general remarks?
I just wanted, if I could.
You might want to pull your mic over.
Yeah. If I could, beforehand, I should have mentioned this earlier, but we do not have any legislation before us. What we're going to do is put this on the website, these changes, and we're going to have an email address and solicit public comment on these boundaries. So we'll have the benefit of the public comment in reference to these proposed, at this time, adjustments, but there is no legislation. So after the public comment period, then we'll move from there. So thank you.
Mark, I'll turn it over to you. So,
variation in the populations are considerably diminished. And here are the actual numbers that we saw. On the earlier slide that was blown up a little bit, so you can see now where all these numbers are below the 5%, plus or minus 5% deviation number, which is the sort of the standard that we shoot for. We're ready to move on to voting rights?
yes.
Sure, I can try to pull up a little bit closer too. Okay, is that better? That better? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the question we're looking at when we look at the racial and ethnic population distributions is, do the racial and ethnic distributions of both the current and the proposed wards, how do they look and how do they compare? And do they meet the requirements of the Federal Voting Rights Act, the VRA? Which is what is discussed in this document that the U.S. Department of Justice publishes. So as amended in 1982, Section 2 of that act prohibits voting practices that result in citizens being denied equal access to the political process on account of race, color, or membership in a language minority. That's wording directly out of that document and out of the act. The essence of a discriminatory result claim alleging vote dilution is that certain electoral law, practice, or structure, including redistricting, interacts with social and historical conditions to cause an inequality in the opportunities enjoyed by minority voters to elect their preferred representatives. So the department's Section 2 cases challenging methods of election for government bodies include actions against a variety of jurisdictions, including states and counties, and municipalities, local school districts and special districts as well. So what do we mean by discriminatory result? It's defined by this landmark case, Thornburg v. Gengels. The analysis of whether or not there's discrimination in the districts is, it begins by considering whether three Gengels preconditions exist. I'm not sure if it's Jingles or Gengels, frankly. But whether these three preconditions exist, and they are: first, the minority group must be sufficiently large and geographically compact to constitute a majority of the voting age population in a district. Second, the minority group must be politically cohesive, voting in similar ways with one another, in other words. The third, the majority must vote sufficiently as a bloc. Majority, white, non-Hispanic, in this case we're talking about, must vote sufficiently as a bloc to enable it to usually defeat the minority group's preferred candidate. So those are the three preconditions that the Act calls for, or that the Justice Department looks at, if you will. And then once those conditions are met, then some other things are looked at. But if we want to look at a little more detail on those preconditions, the first one, the minority is, quote, sufficiently large and geographically compact to constitute a majority in a single member district. In other words, there must be 50% of the voting age population available in a district. And also you can look at what are called crossover districts, where a minority group can usually elect a candidate of its choice with the help of crossover voting from white voters who do not satisfy the Gengels element here, prong it's called. Also coalition districts, where two or more racial minority groups may reach a majority, can satisfy the Gengels requirement, if you will, as long as the groups are sufficiently cohesive in how they vote. Compactness asks whether the minority community is sufficiently concentrated geographically, taking into account principles such as maintaining communities of interest and respecting traditional boundaries. Okay, so politically cohesive is the second of the Gengels elements, factors. Whether the minority group has expressed clear political preferences that are distinct from those of the minority, of the majority. In other words, if they vote similar to the majority, then perhaps there's not an issue. Typically proven through expert testimony and statistical analysis showing the correlation between minority status and candidate preferences. That is, whether or not they vote similar to the majority. That's usually proven through testimony or statistical analysis. Courts may consider non-statistical evidence like observations and experiences as well. There is no quantitative threshold for how cohesive groups must be. It's left open. So the third factor is kind of self-obvious. The majority must vote sufficiently as a bloc. So those are the three Gengels factors. If all three Gengels preconditions are present, then consideration proceeds to analysis of the totality of circumstances in a jurisdiction. So it gets more complex, and they start looking at other things. It's not just those three factors. And the analysis incorporates factors enumerated in a report that's called the Senate factors. So I'll move on to what those are. The factors include a variety of things. There's a bunch of them. The extent of any history of official discrimination that touched the right of members of the minority group to register, vote, or otherwise participate in the democratic process. That's one of the factors. The second one is the extent to which voting is racially polarized, the extent to which the state or political subdivision has used voting practices or procedures that may enhance the opportunity for discrimination against the minority group, if there's a candidate slating process, whether the members of the minority group have been denied access to that process. So these are other factors that the Department of Justice would look at in any given case. The extent to which members of the minority group bear the effects of discrimination in such areas as education, employment, health, which hinder their ability to participate effectively in the political process. And whether political campaigns have been characterized by overt or subtle racial appeals, and the extent to which members of the minority group have been elected to public office in the jurisdiction. If none of them have been elected, then certainly there's reason to wonder why. So vote dilution is an important concept, a voting procedure resulting in minorities having less opportunity to exercise political power than the members of a majority group. That's what vote dilution is. And it's common in redistricting challenges. It happens when there is either a dispersal of racial minorities into districts in which they constitute an ineffective minority of voters, spread them out so that they're less effective as a voting bloc, or from concentration of that minority or those minorities into districts where they constitute an excessive majority, putting more in than is needed to elect representatives of their choice, and therefore limiting other districts from offering that opportunity. So vote dilution claims most often arise when the minority voting power is diluted by the creation of insufficient, what are called majority-minority districts. A majority-minority district contains more constituents who are members of an ethnic minority group than constituents who are white, non-Hispanic. Packing members of the minority group creates too few majority-minority districts where minority voters may elect representation of their choice. Cracking, which is the opposite sort of a packing, divides the minority group into too many districts where they cannot achieve a majority. The standard remedy for vote dilution claim is the creation of a greater number of majority-minority districts. So the Justice Department would look for ways in which that should be achieved, in increasing number of majority-minority districts where they think they should have been created in the redistricting plan that they're evaluating. So the U.S. Department of Justice will examine the circumstances to determine whether there's a direct or circumstantial evidence of discriminatory purpose, including public statements by members of the adopting body or others who may have played a significant role in the process. A smoking gun or other stark evidence of intent is rare and is not required to establish discriminatory purpose. You don't need a smoking gun. Section 2 does not require proof that one or more government actors are racist or bear racial animus. Discriminatory intent need only be one motivating factor. For example, if a jurisdiction purposely reduces minority voting strength in order to protect an incumbent elected official, the fact that incumbent protection was a motivating factor in the redistricting process, or even the primary motivating factor, does not mean a plan is lawful. In other words, incumbent protection does not trump minority voting participation or protection. So racial gerrymandering claims arise when race predominates over other neutral criteria in redistricting plans. To withstand constitutional challenge, one must show that the plan is narrowly tailored to meet a compelling state interest. Case law does not provide a bright line guidance on this, however. Generally, compliance with the VRA is a compelling state interest. The prevailing view is that a jurisdiction must comply with the VRA, but do no more than necessary to meet those obligations. You have to do it, but you don't have to go that much further, is basically what that's saying, according to case law that's been reviewed. Not by me, but by others. The district should be drawn with consideration for all criteria, not just race. Okay. So, that review of the VRA, I hope, enables you to look at the data for the current wards as well as the proposed wards to decide whether or not you think there is any issue involved in racial discrimination in either of those two circumstances. Okay, that's the purpose here. So do the racial ethnic distributions of current and proposed wards meet the requirements of the Federal Voting Rights Act. I'm not going to declare yes or no. That's for you to evaluate and to decide whether or not you think you're meeting the law or not. Okay? And that would be up to the Justice Department, possibly, to review and to decide about as well. The VRA pertains primarily to voting age population. That's an important thing. It's not just total population, it's also the voting age population. So we look at both of those groups, both the total population and the voting age population in the statistics that you'll see. So this is a graph that you've seen before showing the proposed wards for the city of Akron and the population distributions by ward. And then these are the individual race categories that the Census Bureau produces in the 2020 census. Black and African American alone, where people only picked one race, that people could pick up to 6 races that they feel that they belong to or are associated with. American Indian, Alaska Native, Asia, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, and other. And so then there are populations, there are people that responded to 2 or more. All these are based on people who responded to just one of those race categories. So there are a number of people who indicate, and a growing number this census, from the last census, who indicated that they were associated with 2 or more races. So what we've done here is we've taken anybody who responded black on any of the 6 possible responses that people could pick when they were filling out the census form. And so you see these numbers are very similar to the black or African American alone, but they're a little bit higher, reflecting the number of people who included black or African American among others in their affiliation or association with a racial or ethnic group. And we also show the Hispanic population over here. In Akron, there's really not a very substantial population of Hispanics. There are some, of course, but we include those as well in the table. You can see down here that there's, in terms of the one race category, 31% or so of the population is black or African American. If you put them all together, it's a bit higher at 34.9%. So roughly a third of the city's population is African American. We note that because then you can also look at the number of majority minority districts in both the current as well as the proposed plans for the wards to see whether or not they're consistent with this idea of a third of the city being African American and having the opportunity to choose a representative of their choice. Right? So when we look at the table, very similar to what we were doing before, I'm sorry, this is a new table. Here's where we're looking at racial and ethnic comparisons, and we're looking here at the total population, and this is the current wards. You can see that wards 3, 4, and 5 all meet the criteria of having majority minority districts, regardless of which way you're looking at it, whether it's African Americans in one race category or the percent of African Americans of the one race category population, if you will, that's this number, or percent African American with any, of all the 6, if anybody indicated that African American race was one of the 6 at least that they affiliated with. And then this is the percent non-white, where you add up all the ethnicities other than white, non-Hispanic, exclude those, and this is that percentage over here in this column. So, and you can see the other distributions. I highlighted this one. I have an arrow pointing at it because Ward 2 in the in the current plan also has a large Asian population, so it inflates that percent non-white number in that district currently. And you can see some other high numbers in the other districts, but these are the 3 that certainly meet the majority minority district definition. Okay? So if you look at the proposed numbers next to the current, you can see what kinds of differences or similarities there are, and I would submit to you that they're pretty similar. Again, you've got the same 3 districts, 3, 4 wards, 3, 4, and 5 that are clearly majority minority districts. Now, and this one is not necessarily, doesn't quite get to that threshold if you just look at the one race category of African Americans, but it's darn close. And then, again, Ward 2 has this Asian population, which brings its percent non-white, non-Hispanic population up higher. So these numbers are all pretty similar. You can study this if you like, but I think you'd conclude that the numbers deviate relatively little between the current words and the proposed words that we've developed.
Thanks. Just 7 of the words, as mentioned, really didn't change significantly. 7 of the words, 3 of them kind of did. And it's kind of like started out with, there's good news and bad news. Bad news is we've lost population. The good news is we've gained population in one of our areas of the city, and that's primarily due to our new Akronites, immigrants and refugees. And that's what that's due to, a 2,000 person adjustment, if you will, in just the North Hill area, which we always think about as the resettlement area, if you think about that. You know, if one also considers the last 10 years in terms of, you know, what's happened the last 10 years, here as a city, we've declared ourselves welcoming all communities to our city. But also, what's I think important as well is you think about what happened in 16 to the year 20, whereas, you know, we had basically a president that was adverse to immigrants and refugees coming to our country. And for those 4 years, as a matter of fact, we've always had the, you know, a very strong resettlement agency here in our city. But we had a second one that was emerging and was thriving, doing quite well until 16, 17, and that's whenever, unfortunately, there was just no one to resettle. But like I said, this is the email address is going to be redistricting@akronohio.gov for comment. Encourage folks to take this out to their ward meetings to get comment, but like I said, for the most part, there's really minimal changes. Other than Mr. Lombardo's area, pretty significant, and Ward 10, Ward 5 also had some changes. So.
Okay. So at this time, I think we'll open up the floor for questions. Any questions, comments? Councilman Lombardo?
Sure. Bob, did you want us? Oh, okay. So, yeah, I'm obviously the ward that's the most impacted, but a few comments. Number one, Bob, I heard you mention, I don't remember the exact sentence, but you mentioned the word simple, and as far as the mapping and redistricting, and yet Mark's presentation, which was a very good presentation, Mark, but that was complex. It was, if you're seeing this for the first time, colleagues, you know, it was complex. And back to my own situation, you know, if you look at Ward 2, and I have to reduce the streets, which I understand, but, you know, can I go east? No, that's Talmadge. Can I go north? No, that's Caldwell Falls. So I'm limited into some of the streets that I have to reduce, and then we always had to keep in mind the fact that, you know, we want these wards, or a few of these wards, we want the minority to be the majority. So that was tough. It wasn't simple at all. So basically what I'm wondering also is, I see the average 19,047, and I think what do I have, 19,739 maybe under a proposal. But I'm wondering about any type of give there. I'm also wondering that I had 55% with the majority population, and now I'm 55.2. So just a lot of things that I'm concerned about still, in relation to the fact that I just see a lot of neighborhoods being broken up. I mean, I know what Councilman Fusco said that maybe 10 years ago we had it right where, you know, a lot of the neighborhoods were together. And now if you look at maybe a proposal for Ward 2, you're looking at, you know, where once, you know, we call it North Hill, and it still is North Hill, but there's Ward 10, there's Ward, you know, 5 creeping in, and, you know, then there's still in the heart Ward 2. So I still have a lot of concerns. And again, I don't know if this presentation, Mark, is going to be available to the council as a whole. I hope so, because he had a lot of good points there, a lot of bullet points, but it was extremely complex if you're hearing it for the first time. Thank you.
Councilwoman Holland?
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, gentlemen. I've been a student of the Voting Rights Act for a very long time, and you know, I'd like to compliment you on managing somehow to cover more than 50 years of really complicated evolution and interpretation of a dense statute that I think was meant to be simple, but has been, you know, certainly a complicated road. I do have one very functional concern, and I'm not sure exactly who to direct this to or with, and that is that although I have seen a couple of maps, I have yet to see one that really offers me the ability to understand exactly which streets and locations within Ward 1 are affected. And I'm going to find this very difficult to discuss or explain or respond to questions where I'm unable to say, for example, that I'm going to make up an address, 159 West North Street, whether that is inside the new line or outside the new line, and that's just a completely made-up example. But I would like to very specifically and very urgently request that a good map with real visibility be made available to me and to all city residents ASAP, and also get a better understanding too of the timeline for discussion, interaction, resident comments, and you know, further discussion within and among council and with these two experts who are here with us tonight.
May I respond?
Yes.
The map you see here is kind of blurry because it was a screen capture, I think, but we do have maps that, we can produce a map that has the streets and they're labeled, and you can tell where exactly those boundaries are. So in much more geographic detail. I'm going to try to zoom. They are labeled, but it's too blurry for this presentation. But we'd be happy to provide those maps in a high resolution format for people to view as a PDF, for example.
Thank you, and I do apologize. I think I caught the gist of what you were saying, but if you could say a little bit of that again into your microphone.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The map that you see on the screen is a bit blurry, but we can produce a map. We'll provide a map that is high resolution, that has all the streets and labeled. All the streets will be labeled so you can see exactly where those boundaries are for both the existing wards as well as the proposed wards. Is that okay? Did you hear that well enough? Thank you.
Councilwoman Holland, did you hear the response?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. Councilman Malik?
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you to Councilman Fusco and to our presenters. It's clear that there's a lot of work that's gone into this, and I appreciate it. And my colleague in Ward 2 is right. This is very complex. And I went to law school in part to study this, and I'm kind of struggling to follow along. So I definitely think that we should be thinking in the coming weeks and months about how we present this in an accessible way to our residents. So a couple of questions or points. I'm gonna try not to take a ton of time, but The first question, Councilwoman Holland kind of touched on this, but one of the things that we've seen in the state redistricting process, which thankfully this is going to be the legal version of that illegal process, but it has been hard to see some of the maps. I think the map that is on the screen here is more helpful to see, but still it's helpful really to dig into some of the demographic data that has been shown on the Dave's Redistricting app. When those shapefiles are made available, it can be uploaded into that free system. I know I have residents in my ward who have already done some digging around Dave's Redistricting app, the online tool, and who are really eager to look into this more. Are those shapefiles, is uploading this directly into that app or providing those shapefiles to the public, is that something that we are willing to commit to doing?
Yeah, we'd be happy to provide those files. We were expecting to.
Sure, thank you. I heard that just barely, but please, if you can, make sure that the mic's on.
Yeah, I think the mic is on, isn't it?
You got to be like 1 inch away from the mic.
Move it a little closer to you. It should,
Okay.
Does it move or doesn't really move much?
Yeah, so yeah, we can provide the shape files and tables, et cetera. Happy to and expected to, so we'll do that.
Thank you very much. And then it strikes me that you know, to Councilman Fusco's point, so much of the change here is due to the increase in the Asian refugee and immigrant population in North Hill. Perhaps it would be, you know, we could do specific outreach to that community, working with International Institute, working with, you know, other partners in the current community and the different communities to really try to, you know, perhaps provide some materials in different languages so that the Nepalese and Bhutanese community really gets a sense of what we're talking about here, because I think, you know, that does seem to be like kind of a key facet of this, and that's just a comment. And then the last point that I wanted to make was, you know, I would like to hear, you know, from my colleagues and leadership, but also from, you know, the contractors, what the anticipated timeline is. You know, in my view, I think it's good to have the email comment box, but I think we should also look at, you know, providing an opportunity for, you know, some kind of town hall or some other method of engaging folks. And in my mind, you know, particularly if we're taking in feedback and then potentially, you know, going back and looking and making some additional changes, you know, it may make sense to say, you know, we are going to spend the month of May collecting feedback. We're going to spend the month of June making revisions. We're going to pass this by the end of July when we're, you know, going on break. Is something like that, you know, something that is acceptable to leadership or to, you know, the rest of my colleagues? But I think we've seen from the state redistricting process, you know, the more time we can give, the better. From what I'm seeing, you know, I don't have substantial concerns about Ward 8. It looks like I'm losing a little bit chunk of Wallhaven. And I think we can kind of talk about, you know, what Wallhaven has kind of always been split between 4 and 8, and I think it's worth kind of having a little bit of conversation around that. But I think, like, to me, several months makes sense as a timeline to really fully engaging with folks. And also using this as an opportunity to have a conversation, right? Like using this as an opportunity for folks to better understand city government, to get better plugged in about their wards. So that's kind of some of the thoughts that I have.
Thank you, Councilman Malik. Councilwoman Mosley?
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate Triad for meeting with me to address some of my concerns as it relates to the maps. But I will say that I did put in a request for a list of the streets, so I want to make that request again. I want to see a list of the current streets in Ward 5 and the proposed new streets in Ward 5. Because when I look at the map, I appreciate inheriting some portions of the upper part of North Hill. However, with gaining that, I lost a section in this proposal. I lose a section in the bottom of North Hill, and I'm just trying to figure out why is that. I know there's supposed to be a majority-minority balance in there, but I'm really perplexed by that. I did make a few phone calls. I was told there was maybe some issues in that precinct in 5F about a liquor permit in the churches. I did reach out to the restaurants in that area and the owners and those churches, those 3 churches within that precinct, and none of them knew what I was talking about. So I really want to have a conversation about, because, you know, we all have certain areas in our wards that we have done a lot of work in, and we're doing a lot of work in, and you know, I've done a lot of work in that area with those owners, and I would like to continue that work that I've done with them, and not mess up this majority-minority footprint that you all have to use. I'm sort of with my colleague Phil Lombardo on this. I really want to have a conversation about that metric as to, I'm extending up north, but at the bottom of North Hill, which has been a part of Ward 5 for a very long time, I lose that. So I just really want to have an understanding. I didn't lose anything really going east. It looks like Phil lost some of that stuff to Councilwoman Connor, but I think that even for me and maybe for my colleagues, if we could have a list of those streets, I think it gives us a better understanding as to what we have and what we're losing. Like, I see this map, I have my big map at home, I have a copy of the proposed map, but I think it helps us more, especially those where we're all touching each other and we're losing or we're gaining in some areas. So then when we are talking to our residents and having these meetings with them, it needs to make sense to us in order for it to make sense to them. And if I'm having a hard time and I'm struggling with losing a portion that, you know, I've had a great relationship with, we built a lot there. It's very, on that part of North Hill is very balanced as when we talk about ethnicity. So I'm just trying to figure out how I lost it. So I definitely want to talk a little bit more about that, and if it does have something to do about the precinct, I want to talk about that more, seeing that I've reached out to those individuals and none of them knew what I was talking about. I'm concerned about that. I appreciate the metrics, but like my other colleagues, there are certain areas within our wards that we've put in a lot of work. And it seems like there's only a few of us that really had to make some changes. And I just want us to be able to have a conversation about that a little more.
Yeah, I'd like to
before I go having a town meeting with my residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Mr. Dykes?
To respond to the councilman, the Census Bureau provides us with data at the block level. They do not tell us how many people live on a street. As Dr. Salling said, we can provide high-resolution maps so that each member of council can see precisely what streets are in the ward and what streets are not in the ward, both the current ward and the proposed ward. So we can make those so that there's no doubt that if you have an address on a street, you'll be able to decide whether that address is in the ward or not in the ward. But we cannot give you a list of those streets because we don't have a list ourselves.
And I would add, if we do provide a list of streets that are wholly within a ward, that's one thing, but there are a lot of streets that are on the borders. And so somebody listing the street, we don't know whether it's the left side, east side, or the west side, or the north or the south side of the street.
Well, it's not only that, it's that some streets run through several wards. And the street can be, part of the street can be both sides in one ward, and then at a certain point it changes only to one side. It's really a thing you can't do. But we can give a high-resolution map so you can see clearly what streets are in what wards.
But
Okay, thank you.
Councilwoman Holland?
Thank you, Madam President. While we've been talking, I had a resident message me and ask if there is capacity for something like an interactive map. And I suspect that I already know the answer, but I think that the question is a good one in that it goes to the desire of residents to really have a participatory role here. And I think that the appetite for this now is far greater than it's ever been before. And that appetite has been stimulated by what we've been watching, not just in the state of Ohio and here in our area, but across the country. And so I really want to raise my hand and join those voices calling for a greater, a more robust interactive process with our community. And along those lines, and tying in with the Thornburg versus Gingles case, one of the metrics that's used in looking at whether there is an existing block, an existing community and cohesiveness, has to do with something that I think is probably really needed here as part of this effort to get the community involved and to be able, as Councilwoman Mosley mentions, for us to have enough of a command of this to be able to really answer questions. And this has to do with language. I've been, working as a voter protection advocate for many, many years. And something that we know is the case is that there are still significant gaps in our ability, our capacity to make even the voting process open and accessible due to our inability to provide adequate translators, to provide adequate assistance in the voting process for qualified voters who are still dealing with language barrier to a degree in a process that's supposed to be easy but isn't. I say all this to say that I think that we need to have sufficient time and opportunity and process for everybody to understand what is, maybe for some of us, not a super complex process or dynamic, but for others, more complex, and certainly for busy working families, busy people who have a whole lot on their plate, something that is simultaneously new, complex, and just, one more thing on the busy agenda. I think we're gonna really need to take some time with this, make sure that we have interpreters where they're needed, make sure that we have multiple opportunities for folks to get involved, and give enough time that everybody who needs to get some questions answered has the ability to do so. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilman Lombardo?
yeah, it's real quick. Just make sure, if I could request this from Bob and Dr. Mark here. I think sometimes we were talking apples and oranges where we're sometimes talking about streets. You mentioned blocks, so make sure you define block, which is a group of streets, versus, we're just talking the street level.
A block is just what you think it is. A block is an area bounded by streets. In most cases, it'll be a rectangle bounded by 4 streets. So the block is from the is the area inside the center lines of the streets. So if you think of the streets as being north, south, east, and west, it would be west of the middle of East Street, east of the middle of West Street, and so forth. It's that area inside that rectangle.
I know, but when we're talking, we're down to the street level, like some of my colleagues were mentioned, like I'm gaining streets or I'm losing streets, or you have to talk about how you can't split up a street because it's in a block. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, well, what we do is we run the ward lines down the center lines of the streets. That's correct.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
So for example, this is a block right here that my pointer is going around, and all the housing units that are on this side of North Main Street, the east side, and the south side of East Mildred, and this part, this side of Oakland, and the north side of the east Cuyahoga Falls Avenue, all the housing units which would be located along here are enumerated and the population is counted, and the population for this block is provided by the Census Bureau, as well as the racial data. And so the same is true with this block over here, all the housing units which are inside this little island, if you will, think that the block is an island. That's how the Census Bureau collects and reports the population.
Councilwoman Amobian?
Yes, thank you, Madam President. You know, when we did this last time, I recall us asking lots of questions like this, and you, and not you particularly, I know that Mr. Is it Dykes?
Bob.
Was here, did not make himself available to come back to answer questions. So my question to both of you, how much time do we really have to do this? Is there a drop-dead deadline that this has to be done? If so, you need to tell us so that people know that they don't have all this time they're talking about to make sure the citizens understand. And I don't know if people can opt out if they find that they're in a ward they don't want to be in. There is no provision, to my limited understanding, that they can opt out of the ward, because the last time, although it was politically done, we drew a council person out of his ward in order to create the redistricting. So what are we actually talking about in terms of time that's available, and how much time do people really have? Because it sounds like Ward 2 is mostly impacted. You talk a lot about diluting, and I know the people in the North Hill and the immigrant populations, they work very closely together, and they live together in many of those instances, and they do businesses together, and I'm sure they can still do those kinds of things, but they could very well end up in different wards. So how much time are we talking about? Does anybody really know? Because again, we've been through this, we've done this dance before. Legally, are there provisions where this has to be completed by, what are the
In time for your,
parameters?
I would say in time for your next election, you know.
And I know that's 2023, but what does the law say that we have to have this done by?
We've asked that question early on, and we started this process a little while ago, and it's taken a little bit of time to get here, but we can get back and find out exactly what the drop-dead deadline is, and if we want to, hire some interpreters and, bring out these the consultants out there that might cost a little bit more, but this is a very important project, and take as much time as needed. And but in terms of a drop-dead deadline, I think it's just before our next election time.
Councilman Malik?
Thank you. Councilwoman Amobian could sense my question, and she asked it. And so I think it would be really helpful to get that drop-dead deadline, which I assume would be, at some point in 2023, which I guess goes to my point that it sounds like we do have a decent amount of time, and I appreciate how much effort has gone into this, and particularly want to thank Councilman Fusco and President Somerville, again, for the due diligence that has gone into this thus far. I guess my question would be for leadership, does, taking the next several months to do this right, does that sound like something that you're willing to do?
Thank you so much, Councilman Malik. And so we're definitely willing to take the time to make sure that we come back to the table with each council person to address any questions. We definitely want to make sure that we take the time to go out into the community and do some engagement, but particularly in the districts that have been most impacted, definitely like Ward 2. So we're definitely open to those conversations, Councilman.
Thank you very much.
I think if I could, thank you. I think it's important to mention that, you know, discussions with some of the wards, and I know that Ward 6 and Ward 10, there was some discussion because it was very clear that folks in those neighborhoods, they didn't want to be in a certain area, and they identified with a different neighborhood, and that was very clear, and it was, you know, discussed in detail because the community over the past several years had mentioned some of those concerns, and they were brought forward by the council representatives. And so, you know, we put pen to paper, and we spent time to try to figure out how to do that and how to do it equitably. So that's, like I said, it has been several months that we've been working on this, but like I said, we'll have to find out, you know, moving forward exactly how much time, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Thank you so much. Are there any additional questions at this time? Seeing and hearing none, is there a motion for adjournment? If there are no objections, this meeting is adjourned.